The smell of disinfectant, along with that lingering, inescapable mustiness, was my farewell. 1 second ago, I was lying on that creaking iron bed in the psychiatric hospital, feeling the last shred of warmth in my life being sucked away by the cold walls. Harrison's face was lingering before my eyes, still with that genteel yet despicable look. He whispered to the doctor, "She's very unstable and needs special care." So-called special care was nothing more than an overdose of sedatives. The next second, I snapped my eyes open, greeted by a European-style canopy bed with dangling tassels. The scent of bergamot aromatherapy, which I had personally picked, filled my nostrils. Sunlight filtered through the gauze curtains, casting dappled shadows on the silk shadows over the bedding. I'm back. Back to 5 years ago, when nothing had truly begun, yet everything was already in motion. "Madam, you're awake? Mr. Harrison is asking if you'd like to come down for breakfast." The servant's voice came from outside the door, cautious and measured. I propped myself up on my elbows and sat up. The mirror reflected a pale yet youthful face. My eyes were still unfocused, but deep within, there was already a coldness that followed a deathly stillness. I touched my wrist, it was smooth as ever, with no bruises left by restraints. Very good. In the restaurant downstairs, Harrison, dressed in a crisp white shirt with his sleeves rolled up to his forearms, was browsing financial news on his tablet. Hearing footsteps, he looked up and offered a perfectly timed, worried smile. "Joanna, didn't sleep well again last night? You look terrible." If it were my past self, I would have been moved by his concern, then guiltily apologized, saying I had been overthinking again. But now, looking into his deep eyes, I could only see the undisguised calculation within. Today was the last high-level preparatory meeting before the Starshine project was formally launched, and he needed me to attend as the only daughter of the Wynn family, to stabilize those few old shareholders on his behalf. "Yeah, had a nightmare," I said. I pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down, my voice airy. "I dreamed I gave you everything, and then you didn't want me anymore." Harrison's hand paused as he was cutting his fried egg, then he chuckled, "Don't talk nonsense. We're one." He reached out to hold my hand, but I casually picked up my coffee cup, evading his touch. "By the way, where's Lilith? Didn't we say we'd go to the company together today?" I asked deliberately. As soon as I finished speaking, the doorbell rang. Lilith walked in wearing a Chanel suit and carrying a small cake, her face beaming with a sweet smile. "Joanna, I brought your favorite red velvet." "Harrison, I'm not late, am I?" In my past life, I would have thought she was my best friend and he my best husband, the whole of my existence. But now, seeing the two of them standing together, one hypocritical and one affected, the very air reeked of illicit affairs. Lilith's perfume was too strong, so strong it masked the familiar scent of Harrison's aftershave, yet it couldn't conceal the furtive glances and unspoken understanding between them. "Lilith, you go today," I said suddenly, stirring my coffee. Both of them were taken aback. I lifted my head, forcing a weak, perfectly measured smile onto my face. "My head is still spinning. I'd only be a burden if I go. Lilith, you've always been smarter than me. You go with Harrison, I'll feel better knowing you're there." A flicker of surprise crossed Harrison's eyes, quickly replaced by barely concealed satisfaction. He probably thought I was being considerate, giving him and Lilith an opportunity. Lilith's face lit up with joy, though her lips said, "How can this be, Joanna? This is supposed to be your place." "My place, we'll talk about that later." I cut her off, cut her off, my eyes staring vacantly out the window. Harrison, you'll make it right, won't you?" Harrison walked over, pressing a kiss onto my forehead, leaving the faint scent of breakfast butter. "Take care of yourself at home. I've got this." The door closed, and the living room fell silent in an instant. I pulled out a tissue, wiped the spot he had kissed, then stood up and walked barefoot into the study. The safe in the study still had my birthday as its password. Right now, Harrison probably thought a sensible simple woman wouldn't touch his things. From the very bottom, I pulled out a diary with a black cover. It wasn't mine. I never keep a diary. But now, it lay quietly in my hands. I opened the title page, and there was only one line: "Write down what you want to destroy, and it shall come to pass." I gripped the pen, my fingertips icy cold. Outside the window, Harrison's car was driving out of the gate. Under the sunlight, the black Bentley reflected a blinding glare. I closed my eyes, my mind filled with the sting of that sedative plunging into my veins, the bone-chilling cold of the hospital room. When I opened my eyes again, they were calm and untroubled. On the first page of my diary, I wrote the first name, Hingtai Logistics. I even meticulously recorded the way it would collapse. The transport vehicles would be unable to start due to a system-wide lock at 4 a.m. tomorrow, and chaotic data in the warehouse system would cause the same batch of goods to be sent to 3 different addresses. After writing the last word, I felt a faint dizziness. The sunlight was still warm, the scent of bergamot still lingering in the air, but I knew clearly that I was already walking down a different path. I locked the diary back in the safe, went back to the living room, and ate the cake that Lilith had brought. So sweet. Sweet to the point of bitterness. Tonight, Harrison will be in high spirits at the celebration banquet. And little does he know, the brightest gem on his Medal of Honor has already begun to show a crack. I picked up my phone and sent Harrison a message, "Honey, do your best. I'll be waiting for you at home." After I sent it, I tossed my phone onto the sofa, watching the screen dim. Harvey was probably over there, arm around Lilith's waist, laughing and chatting away in front of the shareholders. No matter. The real show was just beginning. The Starlight Project press conference was held at the city's most upscale convention center. Harrison stood under the spotlight, eloquent and impressive, spinning the blueprint I had exhausted myself refining in my past life into something dazzling and grand. I watched from the VIP room on the second floor, a glass of warm water in hand. On the screen, Lilith, dressed in a white gown, sat in the family section, smiling as though she were the true hostess, more so than I, the legitimate wife. The camera panned over her a few times, and each time she tilted her face just slightly, catching her most flattering angle. The press conference was a great success. That night's news was filled with headlines like "The Arrival of the Harrison Era" and "Starlight Sets Sail, the Future is Here." Harrison came home very late, reeking of alcohol, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction and pride. He hugged me and said, "Honey, I made it," with heartfelt sincerity. I patted his back, like soothing a large dog. Then, I went back to the bedroom, staring at the alarm set for 3 in the morning on my phone, waiting in silence. At 4 in the morning, a financial news notification popped up, breaking. Hengtai Logistics faces large-scale breach of contract due to system failure. Multiple upstream and downstream companies send letters of demand. Stock price opens limit down. I crossed out the notification and turned over to sleep. In my dream, I could hear Harrison's roar the next morning. Sure enough, early the next day, Harrison's roar could be heard through 2 walls. "What do you mean the entire system is locked down? What the hell is your tech team doing? Warehouse data is a mess? Wrong shipments? I just introduced Hengtai as a core supply chain partner to everyone at the press conference yesterday." He hurled his phone against the wall, the screen shattering into a web of cracks, spreading like a spider's web. I held a cup of calming tea and gently knocked on the study door. "Harrison?" He turned around, his eyes bloodshot. The moment he saw me, he forced down his anger and squeezed out a smile more bitter than tears. "Did I wake you?" "It's nothing, just a little trouble." "I saw the news." I walked over and placed the teacup beside him, my tone gentle. "How did this happen? Isn't Hengtai usually reliable?" He rubbed his brow, irritably loosening his tie. "They said it was a technical glitch, such a lame excuse." I just finished explaining to the shareholders, and the way they looked at me. I stood behind him, gently massaging his temples. The skin beneath my fingertips was taut and rigid. My voice carried a kind of naive confusion. "I remember. Lilith used to intern at Hengtai, and she seemed pretty close to one of the people in charge there. Didn't you ask her for inside information?" Harrison's body stiffened noticeably. I felt the tension in his muscles and sneered inwardly. In my past life, it was this insider who leaked Hengtai's financial loopholes to Lilith. She, in turn, told Harrison, allowing him to buy Hengtai's shares at a low price and make a killing. Now, on the same timeline, I had set off the explosion early, turning this hidden pawn into a suspect. Her? Harrison's tone carried a hint of suspicion. "She never mentioned it to me." "Maybe Lilith doesn't know either," I said, releasing my grip, my tone growing more innocent. "I just thought, with her extensive connections, she might be able to help." "Don't worry too much. Should I go ask her for you?" "No." Harrison refused almost instantly. Catching himself, he softened his tone. "Joanna, don't bother yourself with these things. I'll handle them. You've just recovered, you should rest more." He picked up the teacup from the table and drained it in one gulp, as if trying to swallow his suspicions of Lilith along with the tea. Watching him feign composure, I felt no stir in my heart. In my past life, when I was running myself ragged for him, networking and pulling every string I could, he never once told me to rest more. I stepped out of the study and gently pulled the door shut. Just as the gap between the door and its frame sealed shut, I caught a glimpse of him picking up the shattered phone and dialing Lilith's number, his voice low and urgent. In the evening, Lilith came over. Her eyes were red, as if she had been crying. As soon as she walked in, she grabbed my hand and said, "Joanna, is Harrison mad at me? I really didn't know anything about the Hengtai matter. I just asked a few questions to help him out, but he thinks it's my fault, She cried like a weeping willow. In the past, I would have been heartbroken and immediately gone to scold Harrison. But now, I just handed her a tissue and said flatly, he's under a lot of pressure lately. Don't take it to heart. Asterisk. Lilith sobbed, but her eyes secretly glanced toward the study upstairs. She probably wanted to go up and explain immediately, but Harrison didn't see her. Watching Lilith's awkward retreating figure, I went back to the bedroom and pulled open the curtains. The setting sun had dyed half the sky crimson. I took out that bankruptcy diary again and opened it. On the Hengtai Logistics page, the ink had already faded, like yellowed newsprint. It meant that chapter had already come to an end. The tip of my pen hovered above the paper. Who's next? I remembered a small piece of news I'd spotted in the corner of today's financial section, about Lilith's father's import-export trading company, desperately scrambling for a round of financing. And the guarantor backing that deal? Harrison had pulled the strings for it. Harrison, since you're so fond of cleaning up after her father, then let me show me just how messy this cleanup is going to get. On the second page of my diary, I wrote, Lynn's Import and Export Trading Company, Limited. Then, I meticulously detailed the falsification of the customs declaration for that batch of fictitious high-end red wine, along with the exact moment the capital chain snapped. After writing the final period, the sound of a car engine starting came from downstairs. It was Harrison. He must have finally lost his patience and gone to have a little talk with Lilith in person. I turned off the desk lamp, and the room was swallowed by darkness. Only the glow of my phone screen remained, a push notification from a news app. Today, stocks related to the Stellar Plan concept remain generally stable, but the implosion of its core supply chain, Hengtai Logistics, has sparked concerns among investors. I let out a soft chuckle. This is just the first crack. The situation escalated faster than I had anticipated. 3 days later, Lilith's father's company was summoned by customs for allegedly forging documents, and that funding naturally fell through. There are no secrets in this circle. Soon, people began linking Lilith to the Hengtai Logistics scandal. She became synonymous with jinx. Harrison's face had been grim these past few days. He didn't go to Lilith anymore, and even when she called, he would answer coldly with "I'm in a meeting." Lilith panicked. She showed up at my door in an elegantly simple dress, her face carrying just the right amount of weariness, and said she wanted to take me out for a change of scenery. Joanna, I know I've been causing trouble for Harrison lately, and I feel terrible about it. Her eyes reddened, on the verge of tears again. Today, Mrs. Cassandra Everly is hosting an afternoon tea at the Ritz. Many of my friends will be there. Will you come with me? If I go alone, they'll surely laugh at me behind my back. She was using me as a shield. In the past, I would always relent and go with her, only to be made to look like a drab, insignificant follower amidst the veiled attacks of those socialites. After I was mocked, she would offer false comfort, subtly making sure everyone knew that the Wen family's daughter was now a cat without claws. Sure, I replied without hesitation. I've been feeling cooped up anyway. The afternoon tea lounge at the Ritz was resplendent with crystal chandeliers and gleaming silverware. A group of impeccably dressed ladies sat together, their eyes carrying varied expressions as they watched Lilith lead me over. Oh, Lilith's here, and Joanna too? Mrs. Cassandra Everly was the center of this group, fanning herself with an air of innuendo. Joanna, don't mind me saying, but why haven't you been showing up lately? Word in our circle is that your husband's taken over the Wen family business, is that true? Don't be foolish, you know. A woman ought to keep her own money in hand. She feigned concern, but every word was aimed at my sore spots. In my past life, I would have blushed deeply at this, clumsily explaining, Harrison isn't that kind of person, only to be surrounded by their sympathetic gazes. Lilith seized the moment, grabbing my arm and acting as if she were shielding me. Mrs. Cassandra Everly, don't talk nonsense. Harrison treats Joanna wonderfully. Right, Joanna? She thrust me into the spotlight, waiting for me to make a fool of myself as usual. I didn't blush, nor did I rush to defend myself. Instead, I simply picked up the cup of Earl Grey in front of me, blew on it gently, then lifted my gaze and swept it calmly across everyone present, finally landing on Mrs. Cassandra Everly's face. Mrs. Cassandra Everly, your information network is indeed impressive, I said with a smile. However, the family business has always belonged to the Wen family. It's just that I'm feeling a bit under the weather right now and have asked Harrison to manage it on my behalf. Speaking of which, I did come across something rather interesting, something about customs. As soon as the words left my mouth, Lilith's complexion visibly paled by a shade. I set down my teacup, took out my phone, and leisurely opened a PDF file, a screenshot of the forged customs declaration from Lilith's father's company, crystal clear. I sent it to our socialite group chat. I just received something interesting, I said in an innocent tone. Lilith, isn't this your father's company? The value on this doesn't seem to match, and the format of the customs declaration number is off. Oh, I'm not really sure about these things, could you take a look for me? The entire afternoon tea hall fell so silent you could hear a pin drop. All eyes instantly shifted from me to Lilith. Those gazes were no longer filled with the onlooker's amusement, but had transformed into scrutiny, contempt, and a subtle distance. In this circle, family background was hard currency, and falsification was the greatest stain. Mrs. Cassandra Everly was the first to react. Her look toward Lilith had completely changed, and she even subconsciously moved her handbag a little further away, as if Lilith carried some contagion. Lilith, what is the meaning of this? Mrs. Cassandra Everly asked knowingly, her tone carrying a condescending rebuke. Lilith's face turned from white to green, and then from green to red, like a goose being strangled. She whirled around to face me, her lips trembling. Joanna. Where did you get this? You're setting me up. Setting you up? I tilted my head, my eyes clear and innocent. I just saw it and thought, since we're all such good friends, I'd share. Lilith, why are you so worked up? Could it be, you didn't know either? I gently set down the teacup, the bottom touching the saucer with a crisp clink. That sound was like a slap across Lilith's face. She stood up, pointing her finger at my nose, her nails nearly poking my face. Joanna, you're insane. Do you even know what you're saying? These things will ruin my father. I rose slowly, half a head taller than her. Looking down at her, I spoke softly, yet my voice carried clearly through every corner. Lilith, I'm just showing everyone a fact. What's the matter? If you dare to do it, but you can't stand being called out. With that, I picked up my handbag and gave the ladies present a slight nod. I'm not feeling well, so I'll take my leave. I turned and walked away, my high heels clicking against the marble floor with a crisp, steady rhythm. Behind me were Lilith's exasperated cries and the hushed whispers of the ladies. Stepping out of the hotel gates, the autumn sunlight fell upon me, carrying a clear, comforting warmth. I knew that from today onward, Lilith was thoroughly finished in this circle of high society. And she would surely blame Harrison for it, the rift between them would never be mended. I hailed a taxi and gave the driver my company's address. Now, it was time to deliver a thoughtful gift to my good husband. Because Harrison's message had just popped up on my phone. Joanna, where are you? Can you come to the office? There's something I want to talk to you about. Talk? Perfect timing. I had plenty of things I wanted to talk to him about, too. Harrison's office was on the top floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of half the city's financial district. At this moment, the setting sun was sinking low, staining the glass curtain walls a molten, blazing orange-red, so beautiful it was almost cruel. When I pushed open the door, he was standing by the window, his back to me, his silhouette carrying a hint of weary desolation. Joanna, you're here. He turned around, his face wearing that familiar, gentle smile, but the tiredness in his eyes couldn't be concealed. He walked over, gently draped an arm around my shoulder, his tone carrying a rare softness. About this afternoon, Lilith called and told me. She said you brought up some things at the party? He asked cautiously, as if testing a cat that had suddenly turned unfamiliar. I looked up at him, letting a confused and slightly aggrieved expression spread across my face. Did I do something wrong? I just couldn't stand them gossiping behind your back, saying you owe everything to the Wynn family. When I got that file, I thought it would shut them up. Is Lilith mad at me? Harrison let out a clear sigh of relief. He must have confirmed that I was still the foolish woman who would go to any lengths to defend him. He even patted my back, his tone carrying a hint of resigned affection. I'm not mad at you. Just next time, let me know first. I'll explain things to Lilith. I lowered my head, burying my face in his chest so he wouldn't catch the fleeting chill at the corner of my lips. He still smelled of that woody men's cologne, gentle and clean, but I knew that the heart beating beneath his chest had long been corroded by ambition and greed. Honey, I said gloomily, I've been idle at home lately, and it pains me to see you so exhausted from the Star Project. On my way here, I stopped by to pick up some materials. See if any of it helps. I pulled a printed document from my bag and slid it across the table to him. The cover read, Supply Chain Risk Assessment and Optimization Recommendations for the Star Project. This was exactly what he needed most at that moment. After Hengtai Logistics collapsed, the entire supply chain system suffered a chain reaction. The solution his team proposed was robbing Peter to pay Paul. But this report of mine precisely pinpointed the 3 fatal vulnerabilities in the Star Project's logistics, warehousing, and settlement phases. Each weakness was a lesson I had learned firsthand in my past life, watching them explode, destroying the entire project. Harrison flipped open the first page. His gaze shifted from indifferent to focused, then turned grave. The faster he read, the more intense his expression became. Finally, he looked up sharply at me, barely containing his shock in his eyes. Joanna, did you write this? I nodded, my tone nonchalant. Got bored at home, so I skimmed through those materials you left lying around in the study. I figured that something going wrong with Hingtai would definitely affect the bigger picture, so I tried to simulate some possible issues down the line. If I thought. Don't laugh if I'm off the mark. I used the word simulate, packaging the hard-earned lessons from my past life, bought with blood and tears, as nothing more than a bored housewife's idle dabbling. Harrison was silent for a long time. He bent his head again to flip through the report, his fingers tracing the incisive data simulations and contingency plans. His Adam's apple bobbed. When he looked up again, his gaze toward me had shifted. Beyond surprise, it held a cautious recalibration, and a wariness he tried hard to hide. Joanna, he began, weighing his words, you've never done this before. That was then, this is now. I smiled, looking gentle and harmless. I just don't want to see you carrying everything alone. Besides, when it comes to the Wen family's affairs, I need to know at least a little, otherwise, I might get cheated and still be counting the money for them, right? I made sure to say that last part playfully, as if I were being coy. But I knew Harrison caught the underlying meaning. His pupils contracted almost imperceptibly before he laughed, closed the report, and reached over to ruffle my hair. What nonsense are you talking about? When have I ever lied to you? He didn't answer to my remark about the Wen family's affairs. He couldn't. Oh, by the way, honey, I asked, as if it had just crossed my mind, wasn't Lilith listed as a consultant at the company before? When I was helping her pack the other day, I think I saw a few expense reports, pretty large amounts. She said she had fronted the money for a company matter, but I remember the finance department saying that project had been wrapped up long ago. Harrison's gaze turned instantly cold. The remaining warmth in his eyes as he looked at me receded like an ebbing tide, replaced by a sharp wariness. What expense report? I don't really get all that, just glanced at it. I picked up my handbag and gave him a smile, my eyes crinkling. I'm heading back. I'll make you some soup tonight. Come home early. I turned and left the office. As the glass door slid shut behind me, I caught his reflection in the glass. Harrison had already picked up the desk phone, his voice lowered to a near whisper, have finance pull up all the transaction records for Lilith's consultant fees. Now. Immediately. The elevator descended, the numbers ticking down one by one. I leaned against the cabin wall, I watched in the mirror my reflective surface my own face, calm to the point of cold indifference. My phone buzzed with a message from Lilith, Joanna, what exactly do you want? I didn't reply. I locked the screen and tossed the phone into my bag. What do I want? I want you and her, like the former me, to fall from the clouds without so much as a stepping stone to catch. I want you, in full view of everyone, to return to me, piece by piece, everything you forced upon me. At 10 in the evening, Harrison returned. His face was as gloomy as the sky before a rainstorm. He didn't go to the study but went straight upstairs into the bedroom, standing by the bed and looking at me. I was leaning against the headboard reading a book. Hearing the sound, I looked up and put on a perfectly appropriate expression of concern. What's wrong? You look terrible. He was silent for a few seconds, then sat down beside me and reached out to take my hand. His hand was very cold, his knuckles slightly tensing, as if he were suppressing some emotion. Joanna, how much do you know about Lilith embezzling company funds? I looked at the flickering anger deep in his eyes, slowly closed the book, and let out a soft sigh. Honey, I held his hand back, my voice so gentle it could almost drip with tenderness. I don't know anything. All I know is that I've noticed everyone who's been giving you a hard time lately. If you think she's done wrong, just handle it however you see fit. I'm on your side. Harrison looked into my eyes, and a complex, almost weary smile finally spread across his handsome face. He leaned in and wrapped his arms around me, resting his chin on my shoulder like a drowning man clinging to a lifeline. And over his shoulder, I stared out at the pitch-black night through the window, my eyes clear and sharp beneath the surface. Lilith, your last lifeline, I pulled it away for you. Starting tomorrow, in Harrison's world, you'll be nothing at all. 3 days later, news of Lilith being terminated from her consulting contract by the company spread through the circle. The stated reason was serious violation of financial regulations. Harrison handled it with a semblance of dignity, avoiding a public fallout, but everyone knew, the woman who once smiled like the hostess at the Star Project launch had now become a discarded pawn. Lilith called me 17 times and sent over 30 messages, ranging from hysterical accusations to tearful pleas. I blocked her on all channels. Her final text came from an unfamiliar number, containing only one sentence, Joanna, do you think you've won? You know what kind of man Harrison is better than I do. You'll end up just like me. After reading it, I deleted the message. Then I smiled at my phone screen. How could I not know what kind of person he is? I know him better than anyone else in this world. And precisely because I know him, I know exactly how to send him to his downfall. Over the next 2 weeks, I started doing something that seemed completely unrelated, frequenting a private tea house on the south side of town. The owner of that tea house was Sullivan, Harrison's biggest rival in my past life, a man known in the business world as the Sniper. In my previous life, I had only encountered him once, at the liquidation meeting after the Starshine project had completely collapsed. He sat across the long table and glanced at me from across the conference room. There was no schadenfreude in that look, only a calmness that bordered on sympathy. In this life, I sought him out early. I didn't need to form an alliance with him, nor did I need to promise him anything. I just needed him to see the real hand behind this Starshine project. I took the intentionally vague patent ownership clauses in Harrison's proud core technical proposal for the core technology, the hidden offshore capital betting agreements, and the fatal weak point in the supply chain that I had verified time and again. I had verified, all of it, and sent it via an anonymous email to Sullivan's encrypted mailbox. 3 days later, Sullivan's team began precisely targeting each of Harrison's partners. The source of their intelligence was unclear, but every move hit Harrison exactly where it hurt the most. The second round of financing for the Starshine project was suddenly halted, and 2 overseas technology suppliers that had originally agreed to sign contracts both announced a termination of cooperation within the same week, citing headquarters' strategic adjustments as the reason. Harrison had completely lost his mind. His office was lit up all night long, the conference room thick with smoke. He cursed out every single one of his senior executives, then called them one by one to beg, lowering his voice humbly on the phone, addressing them as President Wang and President Li. His groveling demeanor nearly made me laugh out loud. In my past life, when he had me sent to a mental hospital, he didn't even have the decency to come see me once. And now, every night when he came home, he would look at me with a nearly desperate gaze, like a cornered beast. He would take my hand and ask in a hoarse voice, "Joanna, can you refine that response plan from your report a bit more? Can you help me reach out to some of your father's old connections?" I looked at him, always nodding obediently, and the next day I gave him a set of harmless suggestions, useful on the surface, but each step actually led deeper into a dead end. He ran and struggled within those suggestions, like a fly caught in a spiderweb. The more he struggled, the tighter it bound him. Then, I started digging into his people. Harrison's 2 most capable subordinates were Zane, who was in charge of market expansion, and Ronan, who managed the finances. In my previous life, these 2 were the direct executors who forged my psychiatric evaluation report for Harrison. I still remember Zane's hand, which didn't even tremble once when he signed, and I remember Ronan's numb face when he handed me the transfer documents for the last property under my name. In this life, I sent Zane evidence of the shell companies he secretly set up, using Harrison's resources to grow his own business. Then, in that tea house's private room, I gave him a cup of tea and a check. "Mr. Zane," I said, holding my teacup, my tone as casual as if discussing the weather. "You know better than I do what situation Harrison is in now. Those little side businesses of yours, once Shanghai collapses, an investigation will bring everyone down. Instead of sinking with his ship, why not jump to shore?" Zane stared at the figure on that check, his Adam's apple bobbing several times. His hands trembled as he drank that cup of tea. But the next day, he handed me a complete set of internal documents, all the illicit fund flows of the Star Sea project and the shady dealings in Harrison's private accounts. As for Ronan, it was even simpler. He loved gambling, and I had leverage, evidence of his embezzlement of company funds to cover his debts. I didn't give him a check, I just showed him a corner of that file. He was silent on the phone for a long time before finally uttering one word, "Fine." Within a week, Harrison's core team fell apart. Zane resigned on the pretext of health reasons, while Ronan's resignation letter was sent directly via internal email, copied to all shareholders. With 2 key confidants leaving one after another, coupled with a full-scale external market assault, Harrison's company stock price plummeted to its lowest point. That night, he stumbled home drunk, collapsing onto the living room sofa. The main lights were off, only a floor lamp was left on, casting a dim, yellowish glow that stretched his shadow long. I sat in the single sofa across from him, holding a glass of lukewarm water, quietly watching him. He opened his drunken, blurred eyes, saw me, and suddenly struggled to sit up, grabbing my wrist with force so strong it nearly crushed my bones. "Joanna," his voice rasped like sandpaper scraping against tin, "tell me, why? Why has everyone around me, one by one, all left? Zane was with me for 7 years, Ronan I brought over from my last company, why now, of all times?" I looked at his face, twisted by drunkenness and rage, at the thin layer of moisture glistening in his eyes. Within it lay genuine confusion and fear. Even now, he still couldn't figure out how all of this happened. I reached out, gently prying his fingers from my wrist, one by one, slowly. Husband, I leaned down, bringing my face close to his, my voice as soft as a whisper. Have you ever heard the saying? You reap what you sow. You've been sowing for so long, now, it's just time to harvest. Harrison's body went rigid. His eyes widened as he looked at me. In his pupils, I could see the dim glow of the floor lamp and my own face, calm and utterly expressionless. In that instant, I saw the drunkenness in his eyes fade as quickly as if doused with ice water, replaced by a chill seeping from the depths of his bones. You. His lips twitched a few times, as if he wanted to say something, but couldn't form a complete sound. I straightened up, picked up my phone from the coffee table, and showed him a news notification I had just received. Core investor in the Star C project suddenly announces withdrawal of funds. GU Group may face a liquidity crisis. I held the phone screen toward him, letting him read every word. Get some rest, I said, placing the phone by his hand before standing up and heading upstairs, my footsteps on the stairs measured and unhurried. There's still the board meeting tomorrow. Behind him, there finally came a low growl he could no longer suppress, like the dying roar of a cornered beast when its last rope is severed. I pushed open the bedroom door and walked inside. I closed the door, shutting out all the sounds. Tomorrow would be the true final reckoning. The shareholders' meeting was set for 10 o'clock in the morning. I arrived at the company 40 minutes early. The receptionist was visibly startled when she saw me. She stood up, about to call Harrison, but I waved my hand and told her not to bother, that I'd take the elevator up myself. Harrison's office door was ajar. Through the gap, I could see him sitting in his office chair, surrounded by messy documents scattered across the desk, his hair disheveled, his shirt collar unbuttoned 2 buttons down. There was no trace of his former, spirited self. Standing in front of him was someone. Lilith. She had slipped in through the side door, wearing a black trench coat, her hair loose, her makeup smudged, eyeliner smeared at the corners of her eyes, like 2 black eyes weeping tears. She was waving her arms in agitation, her voice kept low but sharp and grating. Harrison, get it straight, Harrison. Other than me, who else is going to help you with this mess? You's a mess. I have a copy of the deed to the Wen family's old mansion in my hands. If you don't get me onto the board of directors of the board, I'll hand those documents to Joanna. I push the door open. Both of them freeze simultaneously. Lilith's hand hovers mid-air, her expression shifting from anger to shock in less than half a second. Harrison abruptly stands up from his chair, the office chair sliding backward and hitting the wall with a dull thud. Joanna. He says, his voice dry as sandpaper. Lilith, you're here too. I smile, walking in and stopping between them. My high heels barely make a sound on the carpet, but with every step I take, Lilith retreats further until her back presses against the bookshelf, with nowhere left to go. I turn to look at Harrison, my tone still gentle. The shareholders' meeting is about to start. Don't you need to prepare in advance? I see everyone gathered in the main conference room already. Harrison's Adam's apple bobbed violently. The look in his eyes as he stared at me had long shed the tentative probing and scrutiny of the past few days, replaced by nothing but an unfathomable dread. He was finally beginning to grasp, belatedly, just what Joanna, the woman who sat across from him every day, handing him tea and soup, had done. Joanna, he began, his voice hoarse. The shareholders' meeting, what do you mean by that? What do I mean? I pulled a folded document from my handbag, unfurled it, and spread it flat on his desk. It was a photocopy of the equity registration change certificate, which clearly stated that over the past month, through 5 different nominee agencies, I had acquired 37% of the circulating shares of the GU Group. Adding the original shares my father left to me by my father, I was now the single largest shareholder of this company. Harrison looked down at the paper, his pupils contracted sharply. He reached for the file, his fingertips trembling. How could you, where did all this money come from? Didn't Lilith just say it? I tilted my head, letting my gaze fall on Lilith's pale face. That piece of land where the Wen family's old mansion sits, I had an agent sell it last month. Darling, you're always busy out there, so I didn't get a chance to tell you. But it doesn't matter, since you won't be needing it anymore. Harrison collapsed back into his chair as if all the bones had been drained from his body. Documents scattered across the office desk, and the coffee in that paper cup spilled, its dark brown liquid winding along the surface, soaking one corner of the equity certificate. I didn't spare them another glance as I turned and headed toward the large conference room. Pushing open the door, I found both sides of the long table packed with people. There were Harrison's old shareholders, representatives from the investment side, lawyers, and a few unfamiliar faces I didn't recognize at all. Everyone's eyes shot toward me in unison, some surprised, some puzzled, while a few, clearly already tipped off in advance, their gazes carrying a mix of shock and unease. Harrison was helped in by Lilith. He straightened his clothes, trying to reclaim his usual composure and sense of control, but his disheveled hair and trembling lips betrayed him. He took the seat next to the main chair, and Lilith instinctively moved to sit beside him. I cast a faint glance her way, and she froze, eventually slinking off to a chair in the corner. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, pulling out the main chair and sitting down. The leather was slightly cool, the backrest pressing firmly against my spine. There's only one item on today's agenda. The GU Group's current book liquidity gap stands at around 420 million yuan. All 3 core financing rounds for Project Starfall we're counting on have fallen through, and the main technical team has already disbanded. I think everyone here is clear that the company is no longer in its current state, no longer has the conditions to sustain operations. I paused, my gaze sweeping calmly over each face in the room. Harrison sat to my right, leaning forward as if ready to stand and object at any moment. But when my eyes landed on his lips merely twitched, not a single word escaping them. "Therefore, I recommend initiating liquidation proceedings," I said, my voice not loud, but every word crystal clear. "All liquidable assets will be distributed according to shareholding ratios. Legal counsel already have the preliminary plan prepared." The conference room fell silent for 3 seconds before erupting into chaos. Someone slammed the table in protest, another grabbed Harrison by the collar and shouted, while others frantically tapped at calculators. Harrison was surrounded by several people, his face drained of all color, his hands pressed against the tabletop, knuckles white with tension. "Joanna," he finally shouted, and the entire room fell silent in an instant. He stood up, pointing at me across the long table, his voice distorted by emotion. "What right do you have to liquidate? I built this company with my own hands. What did you ever do for it? Besides sipping tea and watching TV at home, what did you ever contribute?" He panted heavily, his eyes bloodshot, eyes red-rimmed, like a cornered animal driven to madness. All the shareholders turned their gaze toward me, a mix of scrutiny and a hint of anticipation for a good laugh. I took a second document from my bag, not thick, just a few thin sheaf of pages, few pages, but it made the breath catch in everyone's throat. It was an internal transfer record from a private clinic. On it, clearly listed 3 times within the past 6 months that Harrison had booked appointments for psychiatric specialty outpatient services under my name, with each booking's note column reading, assessment and file establishment, do not notify the patient for now. The last appointment date was just last month, and following the note was a line of small text, Guardian has confirmed, recommend admission at a suitable time. In the same file were a few draft treatment opinions, with phrases like depicted in pencil like depressive state, paranoid tendencies, and recommend closed confinement rest recommended, accompanied by revision marks beside them and Lilith's handwriting. I recognized the little groove tilting up to the right when she wrote the word recommend. They had even drafted the diagnosis for me, only needing to transcribe it onto formal documents and stamp it. I flipped the documents one by one, spread them flat on the long table, so that those sitting on both sides could see. The air in the entire meeting room seemed to be sucked empty, with no one daring to breathe. "Harrison," I called him by his name, my voice neither hurried nor slow. "You asked what I have contributed to this company. Let me tell you. First, the initial conceptual framework of the Star C project was organized from the research notes my father left me. Second, the core client relationships of Hingtai Logistics over those years were introduced by me. Third, the contact person for the investor side of your first round of seed funding was a college classmate of mine." I stood up, planting my hands on the desk as I looked down at him. "You eat my food, use my things, drink my drinks, and in the end, you want to swallow me whole. And now you're asking me what I've ever contributed?" Harrison's face drained from pale to a sickly iron gray, his lips trembling violently as a string of garbled syllables escaped his throat. Lilith had already leaped from the corner, shrieking as she lunged for the documents, only to be stopped by the legal assistant's outstretched arm. "Joanna, you're insane. These are all fakes, you forged them," she screeched, her whole body thrashing like a cat whose tail had been stepped on. I looked at her and smiled gently. "Fake? Lilith, when those forged customs documents of your father's were first investigated, you came crying to me the whole night, saying that shipment was something Harrison asked your dad to help push through," I said slowly and deliberately. "I still have the tracking numbers from back then. Would you like me to list them out one by one in front of everyone?" Lilith's mouth hung open, like a fish flopping on a shore. She turned to look at Harrison, hoping to find even a shred of support from him, but Harrison had already averted his eyes from her. He stood there like a collapsing sandcastle, crumbling from the inside out. He looked at me, his lips trembling. For a long, long time, he could not seem to find his words, until at last he forced a few syllables through clenched teeth. Joanna, how long have you been plotting against me? Scheming? I tilted my head, enunciating each syllable of that word with deliberate clarity. Harrison, you call this scheming? Then tell me, the clinic you sent me to fix my health half a year ago, what relation is the legal representative to you? Your cousin, right? A draft medical record was tucked away in your cousin's drawer, with the diagnosis already written, just waiting for the guardian's confirmation, in other words, for your signature. And then I needed to be hospitalized. I placed the last file on the table. It was a screenshot of the clinic's internal system access logs, clearly showing 3 appointment records made by Harrison, with his handwritten signature in the requester column for each one. I spread it flat, laid it out on the table, pressing my fingertip against that line of signatures, the nail whitening slightly from the pressure. The heating in the conference room was blasting, yet the tips of my fingers were as cold as if I were clutching a lump of ice. You even drafted the medical record for me, even booked the bed for me. I stared at Harrison's ashen face, my voice dropping low, every word hammering into the wood like a nail. I just beat you to it, returned this gift to you. As for this meeting today, I straightened up, scanning the room, addressing everyone present. I've been setting it up from day one. Hengtai Logistics crashing was my arrangement. Lilith's father's company being investigated was my tip-off. Zane and Ronan were poached by me. The cards in Sullivan's hand were provided by me. Today, what I'm asking for is simple, for all of you to abide by the rules I've laid down. My voice finally trembled, not from fear or sorrow, but because the moment those words left my lips, everything that had been crushed, trampled, left untouched for 3 whole months on the cold iron bed of a psychiatric ward, all of it was settled, once and for all. Harrison, as of today, you're bankrupt. Lilith, your case has been transferred to the prosecutor's office. I gave them one last look, then turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, there was a long, deathly silence. Then came the thunderous crash of a chair hitting the floor, Lilith's heart-wrenching sobs, and Harrison's voice screaming my name in a tone I had never heard before. I didn't look back. I pushed the door open, and the fluorescent lights in the hallway were blindingly white, falling on my shoulders, cold and bright. The elevator came. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the first floor, and the door slowly slid shut. A week later, all the paperwork was finalized. The GU Group entered formal liquidation proceedings, and all of Harrison's properties, vehicles, and equity were frozen. The personal debts he owed would subject him to a series of lawsuits over the following 3 months. Lilith was placed under investigation for suspected document forgery and embezzlement of public funds. What happened next no longer required my concern. As for selling that villa, it was far simpler than I had imagined. The buyer made an offer without hesitation, and the day the contract was signed, they didn't even come for a second viewing. The agent said it was an investor who had just returned from abroad and decided based on the photos alone. I didn't ask who it was. That house, stained by hypocrisy, tears, and conspiracy, should have changed hands long ago. On moving day, I told the movers to take only my belongings. I didn't take a single one of Harrison's suits, ties, colognes, the economics books filling the bookshelf, or the gold-rimmed trophies. I didn't even keep a single photo of him. After the last boxes were loaded onto the truck, the entire house was completely empty. All the curtains had been taken down, and the bare window frames sliced the afternoon sunlight into neat rectangles that fell onto the hardwood floor, where dust danced slowly and the light slowly spiraled slowly. In the living room, all that remained was an old sofa we hadn't yet moved, and the waist-high porcelain vase in the corner, long empty of flowers. I was wearing my black coat and flat shoes, wandering slowly through each room. In the master bedroom, the big bed had been removed, leaving behind a ring of indentations in the floor where Lilith had slept. On the side Harrison always slept on, the mattress mark was deeper than mine. He always slept soundly, reaching his arm from behind me to wrap around my waist, breathing evenly and gently. In those nights, smelling the aftershave on his neck, I thought that was forever. I stood there watching for a while, then turned and walked away. The study door was wide open. All the files, computers, and books had been cleared out, leaving only the bookshelves on that one wall, empty and hollow, with a thin layer of dust settled on the wooden planks. The safe in the corner was still there, its door hanging open, the inside completely bare. The black bankruptcy diary had begun to disintegrate a week ago, from the first page to the last, every word written on each page fading one by one, the paper curling and cracking at the edges as it burned from within by fire, until it collapsed into a handful of gray-white powder. I crouched down, touched the powder with my fingertip, rubbed it gently. My fingertip felt cool. Then I stood up and walked over to the full-length mirror next to the safe. The mirror was still clean, the movers had wiped it. My face reflected back at me, still the same face as before, soft features, gentle eyes, looking like a white magnolia cultivated in a greenhouse. But those eyes were different. Once filled with trust, anticipation, bubbling warmth, now there was nothing left inside. Like a dried-up well, scraped clean so thoroughly, not even an echo remains. I lifted my hand, straightened the collar of my coat, then brushed a strand of hair behind my ear. The figure in the mirror watched me calmly, lips pressed straight, posture composed. "Let's go," I said to my reflection. Then I turned, walked across the empty living room, and pushed open the heavy oak door. The wind outside rushed in, the dry, late autumn wind, carrying the mingled scent of car exhaust and fallen leaves from the city. I stepped down the stairs, and behind me, the door slowly closed in the wind, letting out a dull, low thud. I didn't look back. I walked down the steps, crossed the gravel path, reached the roadside and opened the back door of the taxi. "Master, to the airport." The car began to move, and the streetscape outside the window slowly receded. Those familiar plane trees, the cafe we used to visit, the flower shop at the corner, in my past life, I would pass by here every day and buy a small bouquet of white baby's breath to place in the vase in my bedroom. Harrison said the scent suited me. All of these were fragments of memory, crushed beneath the wheels, shattering piece by piece behind. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I took it out and saw a text from an unknown number. It had only one line: "I heard you left. Good riddance, good riddance." And signed. But as I read the tone, I suddenly recalled a sudden thought of a pair of eyes looking over from across the long table, calm, not gloating, merely glancing at me quietly. I didn't reply. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my coat pocket. Leaning back against the leather seat, I closed my eyes. The light from outside the car window filtered through my eyelids into a warm, hazy orange red. The vehicle drifted slowly through the city's arteries, the engine humming low and steady. I wasn't asleep, I simply let my mind go completely blank, like an emptied room, not even an echo left inside. During those nights in the psychiatric hospital in my past life, I fantasized about this moment countless times. When Harrison fell into the mud, when he knelt and begged, when I stood high above him, looking down at him, I thought that at that moment I would cry, I would laugh, feel the sweet taste of vengeance and utter exhilaration from a clean slate. But now that this moment was here, all I felt in my chest was a long, clear, windless emptiness. Hatred has been exhausted. Love has long since burned out. All that remains is an empty road stretching ahead, with no shadows of anyone, no voices of anyone, only the wind brushing past my ears, and sunlight falling from above. I opened my eyes. The city outside the window has already been left behind me, and the view is beginning to widen. On the distant horizon, an airplane is climbing, its wings trailing a thin white line across the blue sky, which slowly disperses and melts into the clouds. I lean my forehead against the cold glass of the window, letting out a soft sigh. That diary is gone now. By the time the plane landed, it was already evening. I chose a small southern town I had never been to before, only seen its name on a map. As I got off the plane, a dry wind carrying the unfamiliar fragrance of plants rushed toward me. The airport was very small, with only one baggage carousel. Exiting the arrival hall, I could see the distant, continuous mountain ridges, dyed a deep purple by the sunset. The taxi driver was a middle-aged woman who loved to talk. Along the way, she kept telling me which street had the best rice rolls, which park had the most vibrant bougainvillea, and which tea house was run by an eccentric old man whose tea-making skills were the best in town. I listened, occasionally murmuring an mm. She asked me what I was here for. I said, "Come see the flowers." She laughed and said, "What flowers could there be in this season? The bougainvillea have all withered." I said it doesn't matter, withered flowers are still flowers. The car stopped at the mouth of a narrow alley in the old city. I dragged my suitcase and walked in. On both sides of the alley stood old-fashioned arcade buildings, their walls painted in pale yellow and light green, some already peeling off, exposing the gray cement beneath. Various small shops lined the ground floor, a general store selling miscellaneous goods, a fruit stall offering fruit, and one selling handmade bamboo weaves. As dusk fell, the lights began to glow, and the air carried the fragrance of fried fish and minced garlic. I walked past a shop selling handmade bamboo crafts, shelves displayed rows of bamboo baskets in various sizes. The owner, hunchbacked old man, bent over weaving a half-finished piece, his fingers moving as deftly as if they were dancing. I stopped for a look and bought the smallest one, palm-sized, tightly woven, smooth and warm to the touch. The old man charged me 20 yuan and gave me 2 extra when giving change, saying I looked kind-hearted, as a small gesture of goodwill. I smiled and pocketed the money, tucking the bamboo basket into my coat pocket. I had booked the hotel in advance, an old renovated house at the end of the old street with only 6 rooms. In the courtyard stood a tall flame tree, its leaves mostly fallen, left bare branches pointing toward the sky, casting fine, intricate shadows under the streetlights. The young woman at the front desk checked me in and asked if I wanted a cup of hot tea before heading up. I said I would. I sat at a small wooden table in the yard, and she brought me a pot of pu'er tea. The dark brown tea poured into a rough ceramic cup, sending rose warm wisps. I held the cup to warm my hands and stared absent. The phone sat face up on the table, silent. No one had contacted me for 3 days. Harrison sent a long message the day after the liquidation, his words incoherent and frantic, one moment begging to see me again, the next bitterly accusing me of ingratitude. The last few voice messages, when opened, were filled with sobs he couldn't suppress. I didn't listen to them through to the end, I just pressed delete them instead. Lilith texted from an unfamiliar number, her words venomous, cursing my entire family and descendants cursed. I read about in her curse. I skimmed 2 lines and deleted those too. Then I changed my phone number. The old number, along with that city, that empty house, and the memories of being schemed against and betrayed, I left behind at 30,000 feet. I finished my last cup of tea, got up, and headed to my room. The room was small, built of wood, and from the window I could see the gray tile roofs of the arcade buildings across the way, where a few cats crouched licking their paws. The sheets were cotton linen, rough but clean. I showered, changed into pajamas, turned off the main light and left only the small nightlight by the bed, then lay down. The ceiling was sloped, and a tiny wind chime hung from the beam, made of copper, utterly still. I closed my eyes. No dreams came. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight spilled through the gaps in the window, painting a long golden stripe across the wall. I went downstairs for breakfast. The same little girl brought a steaming bowl of wonton soup, with scallions and dried shrimp floating on the surface. I ate every last bit, even finishing the broth. The days that followed were just like that bowl of wonton soup, simple, warm, and solid. During the day, I wandered aimlessly through the old streets, walking from one end to the other and back again. Deep in the alley, there was a second-hand bookstore run by a tall, thin man with reading glasses. The shop was piled high with yellowed old books and expired magazines, the air thick with the mingled scent of ink and dust. Every time I went, I'd buy a few, sometimes a collection of modern poetry, sometimes local chronicles, sometimes a random collection of essays with an appealing cover. The owner never struck up a word to me, I'd just pick my books, scan the code to pay, and he'd slip them into a brown paper bag, hand it over, and nod in farewell. In the evening, I'd sit for a while outside old man's bamboo weaving shop, watching him work. He wasn't much for conversation, either. Occasionally he'd glance up and ask if I'd eaten yet. I'd say yes, and he'd go back to his weaving. The fine, rustling sound of bamboo strips slipping through his fingers, like a slow, soothing lullaby. I'd sit on a low stool, the day's book spread across my lap, read a few pages, then drift into a daze, watching the ebb and flow of life in the alley, school kids chasing each other home with backpacks bouncing, a woman returning from the market with her plastic bags, an orange cat licking its paw by the barber shop across the way, its tail twitching at the tip. These sounds, smells, and rays of light seeped into my body, little by little. Like rain seeping into parched, cracked earth. Like taking a potted plant that had been kept indoors for too long, nearly withered, and moving it back outside so it can bask in real sunlight. On the evening of the 7th day, the old man packed up his stall and handed me something. It was a tea mat he had woven piece by piece over those days, slightly larger than a palm, made of bamboo strips woven into a staggered diamond pattern, the edges neatly finished. "Take it," he said, his voice aged but clear. "Someone who comes alone is always a stranger. Take an object with you, and when you see it later, you'll remember this place." I took it. The bamboo mat still carried the warmth of his fingertips. I paused for a moment, wanting to say something, opened my mouth, but my throat tightening a little tight. In the end, I just nodded once firmly and carefully tucked it into my bag. That night, when I returned to my hotel room, I placed the bamboo mat on the nightstand and studied it under the reading lamp for a while. The diamond pattern was especially clear in the warm yellow light, every interwoven bamboo strip fitting perfectly together. I reached out and touched it, slowly running my fingertips along the grain. Then I took out my phone. The old number had been deactivated, and my new contact list held only 2 entries, the hotel's reservation line and the airport taxi booking number. I had booked. I dimmed the screen to its lowest setting, opened the photo album, and scrolled all the way down to the last few pictures. They were taken on the day the old house was cleared out. The empty living room, the empty study, the empty bedroom. Sunlight streamed in through the curtainless windows' floor was littered with nothing but dust. I looked at those photos, calm and detached, as if examining the belongings of a stranger. Then I deleted them one by one. When I reached the last one, my finger hovered over the trash can icon for a few seconds. That photo was of the full-length mirror in the study, reflecting the entire outline of the empty room, and in the lower right corner, a small sliver of the hem of a black coat. That was the shadow of my black coat. I pressed delete. The moment the photo vanished, my phone screen went black, reflecting my own face back at me. The same brows and eyes, the same mild-mannered contours, but there was something different in those eyes. Night wind drifted in through the window, stirred the wind chime. Finally, a single soft ring of copper striking copper, colliding, clear and crisp, rippling far through the silent room. I locked the lock screen, set the phone face down by the pillow, rolled over, and turned off the light. In the dark, the wind chime rang twice more, then fell silent. I closed my eyes, my breathing steadying. When I wake tomorrow, the sun will still rise. And I still have many roads to walk, many flowers to see, and many bowls of hot wonton soup to savor slowly. The day that diary turned to ash, I realized one thing: staring at a handful of grayish-white powder, revenge was never the destination, it was just clearing away the thorns blocking the path. The real journey lies on the road beyond those thorns. There was no sign of anyone on that road. But the sunlight was beautiful. And so was I.